Chapter 1. The camera panned down the length of the spaceplane, showing off the marvel of engineering in all its glory. "Jesus, can you see those dots?" Jacob said, pointing at the picture on the pad. "They are actually people. That is a monster. It must be as big as the Airbus A380 at least." "It does look amazing, doesn't it?" said Elizabeth quietly. "But have you seen the size of those engine intakes?" "I think they must be about 3 times the size of jumbo jet engines," said Jacob. The spaceplane taxied around to the end of the runway, and then the camera panned further down, looking off into the distance, following the length of the runway. "I heard the runway is 5 miles long," said Elizabeth. Jacob pointed at the engines again. "Those engines are mounted in a strange place." "I heard it was for the structural integrity of the plane," Elizabeth said. "The engines are between the fuselage and the wings like that, because of the way the forces act on the plane. If there were 4 engines hanging down from the wings like with a normal plane, it would probably rip them off the body, and if they were to put one on the tail, it would be even worse, from what I've heard." They were both watching the live stream from the BBC on the iPad, as were many of the other students in the canteen at the university. In fact, Elizabeth briefly looked around and didn't think there was a table without anyone watching the stream of the new spaceplane. The BBC reporter then came on. "I'm here today at the spaceplane facility here on the Welsh coast, and if indications are anything, the world's latest spaceport, where you will witness a leap forward in space technology. This spaceplane is a marvel of man-made technology, allowing for single-stage orbit access at a vastly cheaper cost than anything that has come before it. This spaceplane can lift 57 tons of cargo into orbit, and due to its modular design, it has, at maximum, a 3-day turnaround for orbital flights and a matter of minutes for suborbital flights, allowing for extremely rapid launch cycles. The spaceplane you see behind me is one of the largest aircraft that has ever been made. It is slightly larger than the old Airbus A380. Not only that, but it is the fastest commercial plane in the world. The plane can get anywhere in the world within 3 hours." The spaceplane's engines started slowly accelerating down the runway. The few people who weren't watching a live stream in the university canteen actually turned around and had a look to see what the noise was. It was that loud. There were so many other people in the canteen watching it that the sound actually filled the canteen. The BBC edited the live stream, making it easier to hear, but the reporter on location still couldn't be heard now. A disembodied voice came over the stream saying, "Sorry for that, we seem to be having technical difficulties. Further commentary will be done from here in the studio, or text updates along the bottom of your screen." "Ha ha ha! Those engines are really monsters," Jacob said, laughing. Elizabeth nodded as well, smiling as she watched the spaceplane accelerate into the distance, getting faster and faster, and eventually taking off into the sky. It was visible for a few more minutes before disappearing into the distance. "Now we have cheap access to space, we may actually do something again," Elizabeth said. She was then cut off as the voiceover came back on the live stream saying, "News just in. There has been an explosion at the facility that builds the new spaceplanes. So far, there have been 3 people confirmed killed in the explosion. We do not have any confirmed reports at the moment, with the exception of those 3 casualties, but early information says that the explosion was quite substantial. We will keep you updated on the story as it progresses." Jacob sat there with his mouth open. Elizabeth banged her head on the table. "What the hell is wrong with this world? I'm starting to wonder that if we don't like something, we just stick our heads in the sand and ignore it as a species. We are so stupid, utterly stupid. What the hell is wrong with us?" "Just sit down, would you?" Jacob said, pulling on the sleeve of her jacket. She realized with some surprise that she was already on her feet and allowed Jacob to pull her slowly back down into her chair. "It's just so wrong. We now have cheap access to get into Earth orbit," she said with tears of frustration in her eyes. "We should be doing so much more. It just seems so many people in power, or those who have the ability to do this kind of thing, just want to put their head in the sand and ignore it. There are even those, she said, gesturing at the tablet, that want to actively sabotage it. Those people are just ignorant, stupid bastards. I know, okay, Jacob said, looking around at the other tables nervously. I agree with you. It's just so wrong. There was more done between 1940 and 1972 than has been done between 1972 and today. We're more than 50 years on, Elizabeth said, snarling. Why those dates? Jacob said, frowning slightly. In 1942, the first V2 rocket was launched. It was the first real rocket to get to low orbit. Yes, von Braun sold out to the Nazis to build it, but some mad scientists are just like that. Some people call it justifiable, and other people say the ends don't justify the means. Then the Russians launched Sputnik on the 4th of October 1957. Arguably, they got there first because they got some of the German scientists at the end of World War II, and they got the most up-to-date rocket technology. Then the Americans launched the Redstone Juno 1 variant in 1958, which lifted the first American satellite into orbit. I'm a bit surprised, however, that the Americans weren't T first. They got the majority of the rocket scientists, and especially von Braun himself. Then the space race really started to heat up, for the dogs and chimpanzees, as well as eventually humans. But then, on the 12th of September 1962, the very best thing in the history of man was announced. JFK did his famous, "We choose to go to the moon" speech, and then, in 1969, they did. The Apollo missions were by far the best thing that ever happened to the human race. That dream, that beautiful dream of human spaceflight, came to an end in 1972 with Apollo 17, and we've never been back again since, she ended, with tears of frustration in her eyes. I'm not defending them, said Jacob, but NASA and the other space agencies have done quite a bit since then as well. They've mapped the whole surface of the Moon and Mars, as well as sending plenty of probes to the inner and outer solar system, and we do have a space station in orbit. Yes, I know, but manned spaceflight did die that day. Well, at least anything beyond low Earth orbit. We still go to the International Space Station, I suppose, said Elizabeth. Jacob just nodded in agreement. Elizabeth continued saying, and what's even worse, the private space industry has been long on promises and short on results, at least with anything beyond Earth orbit. It's strange. I never noticed before, but it almost seems like we're trapped on this planet and low Earth orbit when you say it like that, Jacob said musingly. There are loads of people in the world who want this to happen, but somehow each new venture seems to keep getting sabotaged. At that moment, the BBC presenter's voice came back over the live stream. Breaking news just in. With the exception of 5 orders for this marvel of modern-day technology, the over 500 other orders have been cancelled for the new spaceplane. At present, we have no further news on this story, but we will keep you informed as it develops. Excuse me, further to that last notification, several groups have filed lawsuits against the company that has developed the new spaceplane. Elizabeth crossed her arms on the table and rested her head on them. Jacob reached over and put his hand on her shoulder. What is wrong with us? She said, mumbling. There are so many things in the world we could set to rights. Instead, you have stupid, ignorant bastards doing things like that. I know what I just said about the private space industry, but there are a few that do try, and when they do, things like this happen. She waved towards the display on the pad. Jacob leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes in despair. It's not like we can do anything about it. What did you just say? Elizabeth said quietly. I said it's not like we can do anything about it. As you've just said, other people are trying to do something about it and are still being stopped in one form or another, Jacob said. How much do you care about your career? Elizabeth said, sitting up slowly. Ha, ha, ha. He laughed before his face started to fall. You're not joking, are you? Elizabeth shook her head slowly, staring at him. What in the world do you think we could do? Jacob said in exasperation. We're a pair of postgraduate students that literally have just got our PhDs. We don't even have a job yet. That's precisely why we can do this. I've got a master's degree in physics and engineering, and you've got a master's degree in engineering and business management, said Elizabeth. Whoa, slow down. What are you talking about? Said Jacob. The subjects we've studied means we know exactly that space travel, at least around our solar system, is possible, said Elizabeth. There are other people we would need to bring onto the team, but I think our first port of call should be to go and see Professor Roberts. Why Professor Roberts? Said Jacob. You know he worked on the Apollo program, Elizabeth said. Come on, let's go. Pick up that tablet and we'll go and see Professor Roberts. Just wait 1 minute. What did we just decide? Said Jacob. We just decided to put our feet on the road to confrontation. We're going to make the rest of the human race take its first permanent stepping stones to space, said Elizabeth. A few moments later, Elizabeth was making her way to Professor Roberts's residence on the university campus. She was storming along like an unstoppable force, with Jacob trailing behind her and the sun setting on the horizon. Elizabeth knocked firmly but politely as Jacob staggered up behind her, shaking his head, wondering what the hell he'd got himself into. The door opened and an elderly, jovial, white-haired man stood in the doorway. Greetings, my former students. How are you on this momentous day? Said Professor Roberts. Good day, Professor. To be honest, we, or at least I am, are very frustrated, said Elizabeth, glancing back at Jacob. Oh dear, my young friends, please come in. Come in and tell me all about it. Has it got anything to do with the direction your lives are going to take from now on? Said the professor. What do you mean, Professor? Said Elizabeth. She blinked at him a few times in confusion as she was derailed from her original thoughts. You're at something of a crossroads at the moment, said the professor. Do you continue your research here at the university, or do you start your non-academic careers and go into the workforce? To be honest, Professor, I'm considering taking a third path, said Elizabeth. Oh, and what would that be? Said the professor. Before I get into that, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your time at NASA, said Elizabeth. It was truly an incredible time. We were doing magic, or at least that's how it felt, the professor said, looking off into the distance. I was part of the draft design approval board for the Apollo 16 and 17 missions. He shook his head and came back to himself. Forgive me. Please forgive me. Where are my manners? Would you like some tea, coffee, or another beverage? The professor said. He led both of them into his living room. The live BBC stream they had just been watching on the tablet was also being viewed by the professor, but this was on a large screen covering most of one wall in his living room. Elizabeth and Jacob continued watching the live stream as the professor bustled into the kitchen. Could I have a Pepsi, please, Professor? Said Elizabeth. And could I have a strong coffee, please, Professor? Said Jacob. After a few moments, the professor brought out the drinks, as well as a coffee for himself. My young friends, today is a momentous occasion, the professor said, nodding towards the screen. Cheap access to get into Earth orbit. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see it in my lifetime. It's one hell of an improvement on the old Saturn V rocket, although admittedly they were designed to go all the way to the moon and back. I assume, Professor, you've seen the news about the cancellations of most of the spaceplane orders, as well as the lawsuits and the bombings, said Elizabeth, looking down at the can of Pepsi. Yes, I did, my dear, said the professor, and his face darkened for a moment before resignation took over his face. It is a shame that there are so many forces working against humans going beyond this world. What do you mean, Professor? I've seen some of the stuff on the BBC broadcast today and I have suspicions about others, but could you give any more details? Said Elizabeth. My dear, where do I start? At the height of the Apollo program, there was over 500,000 people working for it both directly and indirectly, including myself. However, towards the end of the Apollo program, there were many political forces acting against us within the government, and eventually NASA's budget got cut drastically. If anything, since then, that political resistance has done nothing more than gathered momentum, making the situation worse. Unfortunately, these days NASA has become strangled by bureaucrats. They have to do assessments on the preliminary funding requests, then assessments on the efficacy and accuracy of those requests. Only if all that is approved do you then need to do the actual funding requests, and then, after all that, the funding can be removed at the drop of a hat. In other words, it takes the issue of filling paperwork out in triplicate to a whole new level. At least the European Space Agency budget for the full cost of the project, and doing it the European way, you know you're going to have enough money to last till the end of the program here in the West. However, in the East, it's a completely different story. They've actually been doing more in space, but they're trying to do it on the cheap, and will probably do nothing more than get a lot of people killed. Other than the political side of things, there is also the economic side in particular. There has actually been a lot of investment in orbital space infrastructure. However, that's because it's profitable and big business. It just doesn't see a profit in the short term. There's also a very large upfront capital cost as well. In the long term, space would be incredibly profitable. But that's not how big businesses with shareholders generally like to work. Last, and most dangerous, at least in my opinion, are the Luddites, terrorist groups, borderline terrorist groups, and the anarchist groups. For example, the nihilists, the technology Luddites, and the ultra-greens, respectively. One of the other major problems is engagement by the general public. They're just not involved like they used to be. One of the things about the Apollo program was that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, everyone who watched it at home felt like they were part of history. And it's the sort of thing that you remember where you were and what you were doing at that time. Anyway, my young friend, you know most of this already, studying what you have and being in my lectures. Why would you want to hear the ramblings of an old man? Jacob sat back in his chair, looking at Elizabeth. She sat there with her head down, staring at her can of Pepsi, turning it slowly. Professor, given all those groups arranged against humans going into space, do you believe it could be possible to overcome them? Said Elizabeth quietly. After working on the Apollo program, I can say that almost anything is possible if, the professor said, holding up one finger, there is more force working towards the goal than against it. Elizabeth looked up directly into the professor's eyes. Professor, I want to get humans back into space. I want us to become a multiplanetary species, or even more. The professor nodded slowly and then said, They are very noble goals, but how do you expect to overcome the resistance arrayed against such an endeavour? Honestly, Professor, at the moment I don't know, but I would like your help with it, said Elizabeth. The professor sat back in his chair and stared up at the ceiling for a few minutes. Elizabeth glanced nervously at Jacob, but he was staring at the live feed showing the space plane's ongoing flight to the International Space Station. She looked back down at her can of Pepsi, starting to turn it faster and faster. The cold and moisture of the can was making her hands slippery. Yes, I'll help you, said the professor. Elizabeth was so surprised she jumped, but she managed to catch her can before spilling it. The relief that spread through her was like a wave of heat and a loosening of pressure that she didn't even realize was there. But you need to be far more specific in your goals, said the professor. What exactly do you want to achieve? I want the human race to colonize the solar system and eventually beyond, said Elizabeth. Okay, but think of something a little bit more short-term and closer to home, as well as being on a bit smaller scale, said the professor. What about colonizing Mars? Said Elizabeth. Mars is a good option, but there are issues with that. There will be issues with every option, to be honest. But Mars is a little bit far away if anything goes wrong with our current level of technology, said the professor. Jacob pointed at the live stream. What about there? The professor and Elizabeth turned to look at the moonrise appearing on the live stream. As we already have a space station in orbit, the moon would be perfect, said the professor. The very long-term aim would be a colony or colonies with populations numbering in the millions or more. In the short term, though, we need a permanent manned small-scale moon base to begin with. Then we can expand as we go, but we would just have to take that into account in the designs, said Elizabeth. So now we know what we want to achieve, which is apparently a manned, small-scale moon base. This base will also have the capability of expanding and eventually becoming self-sufficient, said the professor. Do you both agree? The pair of them nodded in shock. Then they started to smile. We're actually going to do this, aren't we? Said Jacob. Indeed we are, said Elizabeth, a big grin appearing on her face. Yes, my young friends, we are going to do this. Now we know what we want to achieve. We now need to work out how we are going to go about achieving it, said the professor. Eventually, we want this moon base to become self-sufficient and even profitable. With that in mind, we will probably have to set up an LLC, a limited liability company, said Jacob. Elizabeth shook her head in annoyance. Do we really have to go down the corporate route? I am sorry, my dear, but Jacob is correct. This path will be a fairly expensive one, and to get the investment, we need to make this venture profitable in the end. We will have to create an LLC, said the professor. Fine, she said, the smile sliding from her face. Which one of us is going to sort that out then? I will, and I'll also find solicitors, accountants, and managers, said Jacob, sighing. The thought doesn't please you either, does it? Elizabeth said, chuckling. It's not really my forte, said the professor. But along with getting a lawyer for specializing in corporate law, you should also get someone specializing in space law as well. I would recommend you get a graduate of the International Space University. We will also call upon our own university during our enterprise. And I'll go and visit some friends at UCL, Southampton University, and the University of Hamburg, said Elizabeth. I'll come with you, my dear, and after we visit those, would you mind if we visited my own homeland? I believe there are some colleagues of mine that may be able to help us at Harvard, MIT, and Caltech, said the professor. I think we'll need 2 teams. The first should stay here, on Earth, which will include the corporate candidates, and the second team should be our first colonists on the moon. What about funding? Said Jacob. I suppose we can issue shares, possibly loans and bonds, but I really don't want to float it on the stock market if that can be avoided. We could go to governments and ask them for money, said Elizabeth. Government funding generally means government oversight, unfortunately, said the professor dryly, before then continuing. A lot of what we'll be doing at first will be scientific experiments, so how about getting funding from the universities? There is also crowdfunding, said Jacob, especially if we can get the public enthusiastic about this. I agree with you on not floating the company on the stock market, but if we issue shares, we'll be giving control to other people, said Elizabeth. Jacob shook his head. No, if we do it right, we can still have the controlling interest in the company. For that matter, we don't even need to issue shares that have voting rights, other than to ourselves, of course. Unfortunately, a lot of our funding will probably come from big corporate organizations. It may even be worthwhile setting up a holding company. Well, okay, I'll leave all that wonderful stuff to you, Elizabeth said sarcastically. We are also going to have to lobby governments for changes in the law, said the professor. At the moment, there could be an issue with us building a privately owned, built-and-run moon base. What do you mean? Said Elizabeth. Due to the space treaty, no government can own land in space, said the professor. That really creates a large problem, said Jacob. We need to be able to use the resources in space to make this profitable and therefore self-sustaining. Precisely, said the professor. Jacob shook his head in annoyance. I hate lobbying. Yes, so do I. But that's the nature of the beast in things like this. It certainly was when we were doing the Apollo program, said the professor. All that is well and good, said Elizabeth. But what happens if we discover that we didn't have the technology to actually do this? I do believe we can do it, but what happens if we can T? Then there's no point getting the financial, economic, or the political backing. Okay, said the professor. I believe there are 2 main options we could take in getting to the moon. The first one is an all-in-one rocket, like the Saturn V. And while I believe we could make alterations to make most of the rockets reusable, especially with modern-day technology, The downside is it would severely limit our cargo carrying capacity on any one trip. The way around that, of course, is to do multiple trips, but I believe that would make it excessively, even exceedingly expensive and not cost-effective. The second way, and I believe the far more preferable option, is to use the new spaceplane. The professor pointed at the display with his chin. To do multiple trips into low Earth orbit and build a space-only craft. This would have several main advantages. The ship will be able to carry far more cargo than anything that needs to launch from the ground, and it would use much less fuel as it is already beyond most of the Earth's gravity and would only have to break orbit and slide into a lunar orbit. I will admit to having a certain fondness and nostalgia for the old Saturn V rocket, but saying that, I do believe the second option is the best one, especially given that if we build it right, you may be able to use it for other missions. Like to Mars, said the professor with a big grin on his face. I think we should wait until we have the rest of the team before we discuss any more of the designs, said Jacob. The professor nodded. Yes, I agree. But there is one thing I should show you. The professor turned to his computer and minimized the live stream playing on the projector. He then logged into the university's database and used his credentials to get through some security checks. This is what I think you should look at, said the professor. That's a 3D printer, isn't it? Said Elizabeth. But it's been very heavily modified from what I can tell of the designs. Yes, it is, my dear, said the professor. It's been designed to work in normal gravity, low gravity, and microgravity, as well as being able to work in many different types of environment. For example, from 5 atmospheric pressures all the way down to no atmospheres. It's also been designed to use materials including those found on the moon, as well as numerous other handy features. That's why you decided to help us, wasn't it, Professor? Said Elizabeth. Honestly, my dear, yes, it was one of several reasons, said the professor. That's good to know at least, I think. I also think we have done as much as we can for the time being. We need to get the rest of the team together before we go any further, said Elizabeth as she stood up. Professor, I'll see you tomorrow at the train station. Tomorrow it is, my dear, said the professor. Elizabeth turned around and walked out, waving goodbye at the other two as she did. I know this is absolute madness, but it's going to be brilliant, said Jacob, shaking his head. He had a massive grin on his face as well. Yes, this is mad and dangerous. Far more dangerous than I think you or your friend realize, but she is going to need all your help in the coming days, weeks, and maybe even years, said the professor. What? Why? Said Jacob. Because she is going to be the one to bring all this together. But if it does actually happen, it will be because of her, not anyone else, said the professor. All we are is just cogs in the machine, or tools if you prefer. But we need to be the best tools if we are to help her achieve this goal. I'll do everything I can to help her. I want this as much as she does, said Jacob. I don't think you still get it. You want it. She needs it, said the professor. Needs, said Jacob, frowning slightly. Yes, needs it. If she doesn't achieve this, then I don't think she will survive it, said the professor sadly. What? Said Jacob loudly. Keep your voice down, said the professor through clenched teeth. You don't understand. I don't know if you ever will fully, but just go and help your friend. Jacob got up slowly and nodded at the professor. I swear I'll do everything I can. Then he turned around and walked out. I only hope it's enough from all of us, whispered the professor. He sat there for a few minutes staring off into the distance before slowly moving his computer onto the coffee table. Sitting up straighter and taking a deep sigh, he then leaned over and picked up an old-fashioned corded phone and dialed a number he knew well. The phone rang a few times before being picked up. Before the person on the other end of the line could say anything, the professor said, "Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?" "Hi, I'm not too bad, thanks," said the voice on the other end of the line. "I know it's late, but would you mind coming round? I might have something for Project Hephaestus." "Really? I'll be there shortly," said the voice on the other end of the phone line. I'll have the whiskey ready when you get here, said the professor. That sounds good to me, old friend. See you soon, said the voice on the other end of the line. The professor put the phone down and sat there for a moment again, looking off into the distance, before his face turned hard. He picked up the phone again and dialed another number that he hadn't used for many years. Hello, Major Townsley. It's been a long time, said the professor. Are you still in the trade? It would depend on who S asking. Seeing as it's you, then yes I am, said the major. That's good. Would you be willing to help an old friend and do some close protection detail for a while? Said the professor. How dangerous, said Major Townsley. It could be very dangerous. If you want to talk turkey, I'm down your neck of the woods tomorrow. I know that's a bit short notice, but events are moving quickly, said the professor. Fantastic. Tomorrow it is then. See you soon, said Major Townsley, just as the line went dead. The professor leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling and whispered to himself, God helps those who help themselves, and may we truly help each other. Jacob followed Elizabeth partway down the hill until he found her leaning against the railings, overlooking the university campus. Despite the lights of the campus spread out below her, the stars were out, and it was a spectacular night sky. It's absolutely beautiful, said Elizabeth, and you can understand why so many religions are focused on the heavens above us. Yes, I can, said Jacob, sighing. They truly are beautiful. They're like diamonds twinkling in the midnight black firmament, said Elizabeth. It's funny that we're so full of contradictions as a species. Some of the best scientists in history have been very religious people, but if it wasn't for things like the Dark Ages, we would already be out there among the stars. Jacob looked down at the university campus. I didn't want to say anything in there because I thought it would make our position weaker in front of the professor. But why? If you feel so strongly about this, don't you help an already existing organization? Elizabeth glanced at Jacob before returning her gaze to the stars above. I could go and help an existing organization, and there are quite a few out there where I wouldn't mind doing exactly that. I even agree that the more people that get behind one wheel, one direction, and help push, the better. The reason why I'm not joining one of those existing organizations or groups is I'm not sure if I can fully explain it. I know that's not really an answer, but it's more of a feeling and many small reasons. There are many people in the world that want us, both individually and as a species, to explore beyond this earthly realm, said Elizabeth. She then looked straight at Jacob. The problem is what the professor said back in there. There are so many vested interests against these sorts of endeavours. But what makes you think we will succeed against those vested interests? Whispered Jacob. Honestly, I don't know if we can do it. I just have to believe that we can, or someone else eventually will make it happen, said Elizabeth. If we don't go beyond this beautiful blue and green world, then eventually the human race will become extinct. Elizabeth looked back up at the stars and Jacob saw them reflected in her eyes before looking down across the university campus again. It was a warm, humid spring night, with the crickets quietly making their music into the night. As he watched, Jacob saw the odd person passing from one island of light to another as they went on their way, and the night felt peaceful. This is not really a night for such momentous decisions to be made. You kind of expect thunderstorms or something, thought Jacob. Well, Elizabeth, I'm with you all the way to the very end, wherever that might take us, said Jacob. Elizabeth reached out and squeezed his forearm gently before saying, Thank you. That means a lot to me, and we will do it. I know we will, said Jacob.